There is a manuscript in Reykjavik, not famous, not displayed under glass with velvet ropes and museum lighting. It sits in the Árni Magnússon Institute, catalogued, preserved, largely ignored by anyone who isn't a specialist in medieval Icelandic literature. It is called Flatey Jarbók, the Book of the Flat Island, and it is the largest surviving Icelandic manuscript in existence. 225 leaves of calfskin, written in the 1390s by at least 2 scribes, preserving sagas, genealogies, kings' histories, and records of events stretching back 5 centuries before the manuscript itself was made. On one of those pages, a scribe wrote something unusual. Not a battle, not a sea voyage, not a genealogy. He wrote a description of an execution, step by step, with the kind of clinical precision that doesn't read like myth. It reads like instruction. He was describing what the Norse called the blodurn, the blood eagle. And the question that has haunted historians for decades isn't whether the description is brutal, it's whether it actually happened. The Flatey Jarbók was written in the 1390s, but the events it describes, at least some of them, allegedly took place in 867 AD. More than 5 centuries of oral tradition, partial transcriptions, and recopying separate the event from the surviving text. That is either a reason to doubt everything in it, or it's exactly how ancient knowledge survived. Depending on who you ask, you'll get a very different answer. Before we get to the debate, let's start with what the text actually says happened. 867 AD, Northumbria. The Kingdom of Northumbria centered on the old Roman city of Eboracum, which the English called Eoforvik, which the Danes would rename Jorvik, had just fallen. Not gradually, not through slow erosion. It fell because something had arrived on the English coast the year before that nobody in England had a word for: the Great Heathen Army. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled at the order of Alfred the Great starting around 890 AD, records its arrival plainly. In this year, a great heathen army came to the land of the Angles. They came in longships, hundreds of them. Scholars estimate the force at somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 warriors, which in 9th century terms was not a raiding party. It was a conquering army, capable of taking and holding territory. They took York in 866. In 867, they fought the Northumbrian kings. Both Northumbrian kings died that day. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle confirms this. One of them was a man named Ælla. That is where the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle stops. How Ælla died? The Chronicle has nothing to say. The sagas have plenty to say. According to multiple Icelandic sources, the Ragnar's Saga Lothbrok are among them, and Saxo Grammaticus's Gesta Danorum, written in Denmark around 1200. Ælla's death was not a battlefield killing. It was a deliberate act of vengeance, carried out by the sons of a man Ælla himself had murdered. That man was Ragnar Lothbrok. Whether Ragnar was a single historical person, a composite of several different Viking leaders, or largely legend, is a question scholars have not resolved. What matters is what the sagas say he did and what happened to him. According to the legend, Ragnar led a raid on Northumbria. He was captured by Ælla, and Ælla threw him into a pit filled with venomous snakes. Ragnar died in that pit, but before he died, he reportedly sang. The death song attributed to Ragnar, the Krakumal, sometimes called the Song of the Raven, ends with a line that has been quoted for 1,000 years. The piglets would grunt if they knew the situation of the boar, meaning, "My sons will come for you." They did. The great heathen army of 865 was led, the sagas claim, by 4 of Ragnar's sons: Ivar the Boneless, Björn Ironside, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ubi. That 4 sons of a legendary figure collectively command the largest Scandinavian invasion force in English history is the kind of narrative coincidence that makes historians suspicious. History doesn't usually arrange itself this cleanly into revenge dramas. And yet, Ivar and Halfdan appear in contemporaneous English sources. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle names them. They existed. Whether they were Ragnar's sons is impossible to verify, but they were there. and they were in command when Ælla died. What happened next, according to the sagas, is the blood eagle. The procedure, as described in the sources, goes like this. The condemned is held face down. The back is opened along the spine. The ribs are separated from the vertebrae, one by one, working from the top downward. The lungs are then pulled out through the opening in the back. And if the procedure is carried out before the victim has died, if he is still breathing, the lungs are spread outward, draped over the sides of the torso. They look like wings. The Rigsthula fragment in the prose Edda alludes to the ritual. The Orkneyinga saga describes it. Saxo Grammaticus describes it. The Ragnar's saga describes it. And the Flateyjarbók, our 225-leaf manuscript in Reykjavik, contains what may be the most detailed surviving account. The sources do not fully agree on every detail. Some place the lung extraction before death. Others are ambiguous. They agree on the central image, a body opened from behind, the thoracic cavity exposed, the lungs drawn outward. In the case of Ælla, the sagas say Ivar the Boneless oversaw the execution personally. They disagree on one specific thing, whether Ælla cried out. One source says he did not. One source says he did. This disagreement, in what would otherwise be a propagandistic text glorifying Norse vengeance, is worth noting. When people invent stories, they tend to invent them consistently. The divergence in this minor detail has the texture of things that actually happened and were later remembered imperfectly by different people. Whether that means anything is exactly what historians have argued about for 40 years. In 1984, a scholar named Roberta Frank published a paper that, by the standards of medieval studies, caused something close to a sensation. Frank was a professor of Old Norse and Old English. She spent her career at the University of Toronto and later Yale, and she was not given to sensationalism. Her paper, Viking Atrocity and Skaldic Verse, The Rite of the Blood Eagle, made a single, carefully documented argument. The blood eagle was not a real execution rite. It was a literary misreading. Her case rested on how Norse Skaldic poetry worked. In Skaldic verse, the formal, compressed poetry composed by professional Norse court poets, there was a standard set of images for the aftermath of battle. Ravens and eagles feeding on the fallen, wolves tearing at corpses. These images were called kennings, metaphorical compounds that substituted for direct description. A battlefield was the eagle's feast. The dead were the wolf's gain. Frank's argument, somewhere in the centuries between the 9th century events and the 12th and 13th century sagas that describe them, a Skaldic kenning got read as a literal description. The phrase describing an eagle cutting into a fallen warrior's back, a standard poetic image, was misinterpreted as a record of what the victors actually did. The blood eagle, Frank argued, was a ghost, a misread metaphor that had calcified into fact. Her linguistic evidence was specific. The Old Norse verb rista, to cut, to carve, is the same verb used for inscribing runes. The same word that means to carve a runic inscription was used to describe what was done to the body. In the ambiguity of that single verb, Frank located the origin of the confusion. Her conclusion: no one ever performed a blood eagle. The sources describing it were written 3 to 5 centuries after the supposed events, by Christian scribes who misread poetic formulae as historical record, and who may have had their own reasons for presenting them as literal. Frank's paper was highly influential. For a generation, it represented the consensus position. That consensus has since started to crack. In 2017, scholars including Tom Shippey, known primarily as a Tolkien scholar, but also a serious Old Norse linguist, and others working in the field began pushing back on Frank's argument systematically. Their case rested on several points. First, the number of independent attestations. The blood eagle appears not once, not twice, but in at least 4 distinct sources, including non-Icelandic ones like Saxo Grammaticus. For a literary misreading to account for all of them, you need to explain how the same misreading was independently made in multiple textual traditions across different countries and different centuries. That is possible. It becomes increasingly difficult to defend as an explanation the more times you have to invoke it. Second, the ritual context. Frank's argument depends on the blood eagle originating as an image of birds feeding on a corpse after battle. But the sources don't describe that. They describe a deliberate procedure carried out on a living or recently killed captive by named individuals as a specific act of vengeance or sacrifice. The context is not poetic ambiguity. It is purposeful, organized human action. Third, the comparative evidence. Ritual killing in Norse culture, killing that went beyond what was militarily necessary and imposed symbolic meaning on the body, is not absent from the archaeological record. In 1980, a mass grave was excavated at Repton in Derbyshire. Repton was the site of a Viking winter camp in 873 AD, 8 years after the great heathen army arrived, 6 years after Ælla's death. The grave contained the remains of around 264 individuals. Most were male. Many showed evidence of violent death and peri-mortem bone damage, damage to the bones that occurred around the time of death, not long before or after. Some of the wounds showed patterns consistent with deliberate, targeted cutting, not the chaotic trauma of a battle. Something more intentional. It does not prove the blood eagle, but it establishes something important. The people who sacked Northumbria were not squeamish about what they did to bodies after fighting stopped. In 2009, construction work in Dorset uncovered a mass burial. 54 decapitated male skeletons, their skulls piled separately. Isotope analysis placed the men as Scandinavian. The decapitations were clean and administered from the front, suggesting execution rather than combat. Again, not blood eagle evidence specifically, but evidence that formalized, ritualized killing was part of how this culture processed its enemies. Several forensic specialists have weighed in on the physical possibility of the procedure as described. The conclusions vary. Some argue it is anatomically feasible. A skilled person with a sharp implement could separate ribs from the spine, and the lungs could be displaced outward through such an opening. Whether they would remain functional in that position is a separate question. Others point to descriptions in the sagas that contain apparent anatomical impossibilities. The debate remains unresolved for obvious reasons. The sagas do not describe the blood eagle as a common punishment. It is not applied to ordinary soldiers, to slaves, or to low-status enemies. The cases in which it appears, somewhere between 3 and 5, depending on how you count, share a consistent feature. The victims are kings or powerful chieftains. Ælla of Northumbria, Halfdan Longlegs, executed by Jarl Torf Einar on Orkney, as recorded in the Orkneyinga saga, possibly others. 3 cases is not a statistical pattern, but it is suggestive. If the blood eagle were pure literary invention, you might expect it to appear more frequently and applied to a wider range of enemies. The fact that it appears specifically and only in the context of executing the highest status opponents, in the context of formal vengeance, not casual battlefield violence, looks less like a recurring literary device and more like a practice whose application was deliberately restricted. In sacred contexts, restriction is how significance is preserved. In June of 921 AD, an Arab diplomat named Ahmad ibn Fadlan traveled to the Volga River. Ibn Fadlan was a meticulous observer. He found the Rus, the Norse traders and raiders who dominated the Volga trade routes, deeply unsettling, and he said so with considerable candor. He described their hygiene habits, he described their appearance, and he described, in complete detail, a funeral ceremony he personally witnessed. A Rus chieftain had died. His body was preserved for 10 days while preparations were made. His ship was dragged to shore, his possessions were assembled, and then a slave girl, who had either volunteered or been designated, was killed during the ceremony. The killing was performed by a woman called the Angel of Death, using a blade to the chest, while 2 men held the girl's hands and ankles. Ibn Fadlan watched this from approximately 15 meters away. He wrote it all down. The reason this matters is not the specific method. The reason it matters is what it establishes about the culture. Ibn Fadlan was not describing a saga. He was not working from a Skaldic poem. He was there, watching, taking notes, deeply disturbed by what he saw. And the ritual he witnessed, formalized, purposeful, with assigned roles and specific timing, is exactly the kind of practice the Blood Eagle's defenders argue belonged to the same framework of thought. A culture that conducted funerals this way understood ritual killing as a legitimate category of human action, not unusual, not aberrant, purposeful. The Norse cosmological background adds a layer that the debate sometimes passes over quickly. Odin, the Allfather, the god of war, wisdom, and death, is associated with eagles and ravens in equal measure. His ravens Hugin and Munin fly across the world and return to whisper what they've seen. The eagle at the top of Yggdrasil, the world tree, sees everything from above. In Norse cosmology, the eagle is not simply a predator. It is the creature that occupies the highest position, the one that comprehends what men on the ground cannot. When Odin himself sought wisdom, not from another god, but from the universe itself, he hung on Yggdrasil for 9 days and 9 nights, pierced by his own spear, without food or water, suspended between life and death. The suffering was not a side effect of the process. The suffering was the process. Only through endured agony did the runes reveal themselves to him. This is the cosmological world in which, if the blood eagle was a real rite, it took place. The ribs opened outward like wings. The lungs, the seat of breath, of life, pulled outward into the shape of what Odin sees from above. The body of the condemned not merely destroyed, but transformed into something that belonged to a different order. The blood eagle appears only for enemies of sufficient stature to be worth consecrating. Ælla killed a king. His death, within this logic, required not just vengeance, but dedication. He was not simply defeated. He was offered. This reading is speculative. It cannot be proven from the sources, but it is internally consistent with everything we know about how this culture thought about death, suffering, and transformation. And it explains the restriction of the practice to high-status victims in a way that it was always literary fiction does not. The Jorvik Viking Center in York stands above the excavated remains of a 9th century Norse settlement, the same city the great heathen army took in 866. The street plan of Viking-era Jorvik is preserved beneath the modern city. Fragments of ordinary life survive there. Combs, shoes, food waste, workshops. In 2015, a large-scale genetic study of the British population found clear evidence of Scandinavian ancestry concentrated in the east and north of England, in Yorkshire, in regions whose boundaries correspond almost exactly to the territories held by the Viking kingdom of Jorvik. The genetic signal dated to the Viking Age. The highest concentrations tracked precisely where the great heathen army had campaigned and settled. These are the biological descendants, in the most literal sense, of the army that killed Ælla. Whatever happened in Northumbria in 867, battle, execution, ritual, sacrifice, its genetic consequence is still traceable in people living today. The flighty Jarbok is still in Reykjavik. It was returned to Iceland in 1971 after nearly 3 centuries in Danish custody. The calfskin is still legible. The passage describing the blood eagle is still there, in medieval Icelandic, in handwriting that hasn't changed in 600 years. Roberta Frank's argument is still debated in academic journals. The forensic questions remain unanswered. The archaeological record continues to expand. New burials, new isotope studies, new perimortem bone analysis, without settling the central question. What the sources agree on is this. An English king died in Northumbria in 867 at the hands of a Viking army. The Viking Age would continue for another 200 years. The great heathen army was not the end of anything. It was closer to a beginning. Whether the blood eagle was real depends on what you're willing to accept as evidence. If you require contemporary written accounts, you don't have them. If you require direct physical evidence, you don't have that either. What you have is a cluster of later sources, written independently in different countries, at different times, describing the same unusual and specific procedure, with enough consistency to suggest they were drawing on something real, and enough divergence in minor details to suggest they weren't all copying from a single fictional template. The most unsettling thing about the blood eagle may not be the procedure itself. It may be that we cannot prove it didn't happen. A story that precise, preserved for that long, in that many independent sources, that kind of story doesn't survive because there was nothing else to talk about. It survives because somewhere in the chain of transmission, someone remembered something and couldn't stop telling it. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.